Think about this for a second. Every time you buy a coffee, pick up groceries, or grab something online, there's a tax quietly added to the total sales tax. It's so woven into daily life that most Americans don't even think about it anymore. It's just there, like gravity, like the air. But here's the thing that might stop you in your tracks. For the first 150 years of America's existence, sales tax simply did not exist. Not at the state level, not at the federal level, nowhere. The first general sales tax in this country wasn't introduced until 1930, when Mississippi, of all places, became the pioneer. Before that, not a single state in the Union charged its citizens a percentage on everyday purchases. And yet somehow America built roads, funded wars, erected courthouses, ran schools, maintained police forces, and expanded from 13 colonies clinging to the Atlantic coastline into a continental superpower stretching from sea to shining sea. So how did they do it? How did state governments keep the lights on for over a century without what is now one of their most important sources of revenue? The answer takes you deep into the financial architecture of early America, and what you find there is stranger, more creative, and far more ruthless than you might expect. Because the story of how American states made money before the sales tax is really a story about power, about who pays and who doesn't, about the deals made in back rooms between politicians and railroad barons, and about a tax system that was designed from the very beginning to serve the interests of the people who built it. Let's start at the very beginning, 1789. The United States Constitution has just been ratified, and the brand new federal government has a very serious problem. It's broke. The Revolutionary War left the country drowning in debt, owed to foreign governments, to domestic creditors, to soldiers who fought and bled for independence and hadn't been paid. The total debt was staggering, somewhere in the range of $79 million, which in today's money would be well over $2 billion. And the country had almost no reliable way to bring in revenue. Under the old Articles of Confederation, the federal government couldn't even levy taxes directly. It had to go hat in hand to the individual states and politely ask them to contribute. And the states, as you might imagine, often said no. So when Alexander Hamilton stepped into his role as the first Secretary of the Treasury, he inherited a fiscal nightmare. Hamilton was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly pragmatic. He understood that a nation without revenue was a nation without sovereignty, and so his very first major act was to push Congress to pass the Tariff Act of 1789, which placed taxes on goods imported into the United States. This was the backbone of the early federal budget. Tariffs, customs duties, taxes collected at the ports where foreign goods entered the country. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Here's why tariffs were so appealing in those early decades. First, they were administratively simple. You didn't need an army of tax collectors fanning out across a vast and largely rural nation. You just needed customs officers stationed at a limited number of harbors and ports along the coast. Ships came in, goods were inspected, duties were assessed, and revenue flowed into the treasury. Second, tariffs served a dual purpose. They raised money for the government, and they protected American manufacturers from foreign competition by making imported goods more expensive. This was Hamilton's grand vision. He laid it all out in his 1791 report on manufacturers, arguing for what he called protective duties. Tariffs set high enough that the price of imported items would exceed the price of similar goods produced domestically. The idea was to nurture America's infant industries, to give homegrown manufacturers a chance to grow strong enough to compete on the world stage. And it worked, at least for a while. Throughout the 19th century, customs duties accounted for between 50 and 90% of total federal revenue. Let that sink in for a moment. The overwhelming majority of every dollar the federal government spent, from national defense to the post office to paying off war debts, came from taxes on imported goods. In 1900, total federal spending was about $520 million, roughly 2.5% of the entire GDP. Customs duties alone generated about $230 million of that, nearly half. There was no permanent federal income tax. Washington's responsibilities were limited to national defense, debt service, the postal system, customs administration, and Civil War pensions. The government was, by today's standards, vanishingly small. But tariffs weren't the only tool in the federal toolkit. Hamilton knew that relying too heavily on customs revenue was risky. Trade fluctuated, wars disrupted shipping lanes. And so, in 1791, he proposed something much more controversial: a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. Now, this was not a sales tax in any modern sense. It wasn't a broad levy on consumer goods at the point of purchase. It was a targeted tax on a specific product, and in this case, that product was whiskey. The tax rates varied, ranging from about 6 to 18 cents per gallon, and they fell disproportionately on small distillers, who often ended up paying more than twice per gallon what the larger producers paid. On the frontier, especially in western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency, it was a way of life. Farmers grew grain, corn, rye, wheat, and the most practical thing they could do with that harvest was distill it into whiskey, which was far easier to transport and far more valuable per pound than raw grain. When Hamilton's excise tax hit, these frontier farmers saw it as an act of tyranny, barely distinguishable from the British taxes that had triggered the revolution itself. They refused to pay. They terrorized tax collectors. They tarred and feathered revenue agents and paraded them through towns. By 1794, the resistance had escalated into what history remembers as the Whiskey Rebellion. President George Washington, at Hamilton's urging, assembled a militia of 13,000 troops and personally led them westward into Pennsylvania. It was the first time the new federal government used military force to enforce its own laws within state borders. The rebellion collapsed without a major battle. Washington pardoned the ringleaders, but the message was clear. The federal government would tax what it pleased, and it would use force to collect. Now here's where things get interesting, because while the federal government was funding itself primarily through tariffs and the occasional excise tax, the states were playing a completely different game, and their financial toolkit was in many ways even more creative, more varied, and more chaotic than anything happening at the national level. So how did American states actually make money before 1930? The answer involves at least half a dozen distinct revenue streams, some of which might genuinely surprise you. The most important one, the heavyweight champion of state and local finance for most of American history, was the property tax. Every single state had some form of property tax by the 1790s. In the colonial era, property taxes were already well established, and they continued after independence as the primary means by which state and local governments funded their operations. The concept was straightforward. If you owned land, buildings, or other tangible property, the government assessed its value and charged you a percentage. Sheriffs or local assessors would ride out to farms and businesses, estimate the value of the property, and send a bill. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, property taxes were the overwhelming majority of state and local revenue. By the time the Census Bureau started collecting government finance data in 1902, property taxes provided 45% of the general revenue that state governments collected from their own sources. At the local level, the numbers were even more dramatic. By 1932, property taxes accounted for a staggering 85.2% of all local government revenue from their own sources. Think about that. Before the Great Depression, local governments in America were almost entirely funded by a single tax on land and buildings. But the property tax had enormous problems, and those problems shaped the financial history of the country in ways that echo to this day. The first issue was assessment. How do you determine the value of a piece of land in a vast, largely rural country where professional appraisers were rare and record-keeping was primitive? Assessments were wildly inconsistent. Two neighboring farms of similar size and quality might be assessed at completely different values depending on the whims or the honesty of the local assessor. Political favoritism was rampant. If the assessor happened to be your cousin, your land might mysteriously be valued much lower than your neighbor's. Corruption wasn't the exception, it was the norm. The second issue was that property taxes were deeply regressive in practice. In theory, they taxed wealth. In reality, they fell hardest on small farmers and homeowners who had most of their wealth tied up in land. Wealthy merchants, bankers, and industrialists could hold their assets in stocks, bonds, and other financial instruments that were far harder to assess and far easier to hide. The rich had ways to shelter their wealth. Ordinary people didn't. And the third issue was volatility. Property values fluctuated wildly with economic conditions. In good times, assessments rose and revenues poured in. In bad times, property values crashed, tax delinquency soared, and state and local governments found themselves staring into the abyss. Now here's something that might seem counterintuitive. In the early 1800s, many states actually reduced or even eliminated their property taxes entirely. After Alexander Hamilton's funding proposal had the federal government assume most existing state debts, several states found themselves in surprisingly good fiscal shape by 1800. And rather than maintain high property taxes, they simply dropped them. By the 1830s, the downward trend in state property tax collections was unmistakable. State revenues per capita were falling, not because state budgets were shrinking, but because states had found other ways to make money. And the biggest of those alternative revenue sources was something that might shock a modern audience. States were making money by going into business for themselves. The most dramatic example of this was the canal boom. When the state of New York decided to build the Erie Canal in 1817, it was the largest infrastructure project in American history to that point. The canal would run 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes via the Hudson River. It required 83 locks to negotiate a 573-foot difference in water levels, and it was funded not by tax revenue but by state-issued bonds. New York's bond program was among America's first major use of revenue bonds. Government bonds that pay interest and principal from the specific asset they're funding rather than from general tax revenue. It was a massive gamble. The total lending would amount to roughly $200 million in today's money, almost three-quarters the size of the entire 1817 federal budget. But the gamble paid off spectacularly. The Erie Canal generated enough toll revenue to cover its debt service during its very first year of operation. By 1834, less than a decade after the grand opening, toll revenues exceeded $8 million, erasing the original construction debt completely. New York City went from being the seventh largest port in America in the 1790s to the largest by 1830. Grain shipments from the northwest to the coast soared more than 30-fold during the canal's first 3 decades. The canal didn't just make money for New York State, it transformed the entire American economy. And that's when things went sideways, because every other state looked at the Erie Canal and thought, we need one of those. Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and nearly every state with a pulse started borrowing heavily from European investors, particularly British banks, to fund their own canal and railroad projects. By 1838, state debt was 8 times local debt and 30 times the national debt. States were the biggest borrowers in America, and they were using that borrowed money to build transportation infrastructure at a frantic pace. But most of these projects were not the Erie Canal. Most of them ran through less favorable geography, served smaller markets, and never generated the toll revenue their supporters had promised. When the Panic of 1839 hit and the economy plunged into a sharp depression, the house of cards collapsed. By 1842, 8 states and the territory of Florida had defaulted on their debts. Pennsylvania alone had racked up over $30 million in transportation investment debt, worth roughly $1.1 billion in today's money. Maryland had borrowed over $12 million, with more than $11 million going directly to transportation. The default sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. European investors who had been eagerly buying American state bonds with their 5, 6, and sometimes 7% yields were suddenly staring at worthless paper. The backlash was severe. American creditworthiness on international markets was damaged for a generation. The canal disaster had a lasting effect on American state finance. Many states rewrote their constitutions in the aftermath, adding strict limits on government borrowing and debt. The era of states acting as entrepreneurs, investing directly in infrastructure and hoping to profit from tolls and revenues, was largely over. From this point forward, states would increasingly leave large-scale infrastructure financing to the private sector, while focusing on raising revenue through more traditional means. And that brings us to the other creative ways states made money before the sales tax existed. Because beyond property taxes and bond-funded infrastructure, states had an entire portfolio of revenue tools that most people today have completely forgotten about. One of the oldest and most important was the poll tax. A poll tax, also called a head tax or capitation tax, was a fixed sum levied on every eligible adult, regardless of income or property. The word poll comes from an Old English term for head, as in counting heads. Poll taxes had been used in the American colonies from the very beginning. Virginia relied on the poll tax as essentially its only direct tax for years. Maryland had practically no other direct tax before the Revolution. After independence, poll taxes continued to be a standard revenue source for most states throughout the 19th century. By 1923, 38 states either permitted or required the collection of poll taxes. The amount varied from about $1 to $5 per person, and the proceeds were typically earmarked for specific public needs like schools or roads. But poll taxes carried a dark underbelly, especially in the South. After the Civil War and through the era of Jim Crow, southern states weaponized the poll tax as a tool of voter suppression. By making tax payment a prerequisite for voting and by setting the tax at amounts that poor black citizens couldn't afford, states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Virginia effectively disenfranchised millions of Americans. The poll tax as a voting requirement wasn't fully abolished until the 24th Amendment in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then there were license fees and business taxes. States charged fees for the privilege of operating certain businesses, from taverns and retail shops to professions like medicine and law. Pennsylvania had a mercantile license tax as early as 1821, which is sometimes cited as one of the earliest precursors to the modern sales tax. These weren't taxes on transactions themselves, but rather flat fees paid by merchants for the right to operate their businesses. The revenue generated was modest compared to property taxes, but it added up, and it gave state governments a foothold in regulating and profiting from commercial activity. Some states like Pennsylvania and Maryland managed to collect a significant share of their total income from these kinds of licensing fees. For most states, though, the revenue from fees was relatively small, a supplement rather than a foundation. And then there was one of the most fascinating and morally ambiguous revenue sources of early America, the state lottery. Before you dismiss this as a modern invention, understand that lotteries were one of the most important fiscal tools available to colonial and early American governments. The Continental Congress itself held a lottery in 1776 to raise money for the soldiers of the Revolution. And after independence, the newly formed states leaned heavily on lotteries to fund public works, in large part because they were terrified of taxing citizens who had just fought a revolution against taxation by a central authority. The lottery was the perfect solution. It was voluntary. Nobody forced you to buy a ticket, and if you did buy one, you had a chance of winning a prize. Governments skimmed a portion of the ticket sales to fund whatever project needed financing. Between 1790 and 1860, 24 of the 33 states used lotteries to finance jails, courthouses, hospitals, orphanages, libraries, schools, colleges, and churches. Lotteries funded the growth of America's earliest and most prestigious universities, including Harvard, Yale, and the College of New Jersey, which later became became Princeton. When Boston's iconic Faneuil Hall burned down in 1761, it was a lottery that paid to rebuild it. By 1831, the city of Philadelphia alone had over 100 shops that sold nothing but lottery tickets. The lottery was so embedded in American civic life that it was essentially treated as a voluntary tax for public improvement. But corruption was the lottery's undoing. By the mid-19th century, scandals had eroded public trust. Crooked lottery agents absconded with proceeds. Fraudulent drawings became common. Congress itself ran a series of federal lotteries between 1792 and 1842 to improve roads and infrastructure in Washington, D.C., but the agents conducting the lotteries literally stole the money and disappeared. By the late 1800s, a backlash against lottery corruption led most states to ban them entirely. The lottery wouldn't make a major comeback as a state revenue tool until the 20th century. There's another revenue source that often gets overlooked in these discussions, and that's public land sales. Particularly in the early decades of the Republic, the sale of federal and state-owned land was a significant source of government income. The Continental Congress passed the Land Ordinance of 1785, specifically to raise money through land sales in the territories northwest of the Ohio River. As the country expanded westward, the federal government controlled enormous tracts of land that it could sell or auction off to settlers, speculators, and developers. Land sales were not just about revenue, they were instruments of policy. Cheap land encouraged westward migration. Expensive land raised more money for the treasury. The balance between these two goals was a constant source of political tension. At the state level, many governments also held and sold public lands, using the proceeds to fund operations or reduce the need for tax increases. In some periods, land sales were the second largest source of federal revenue after tariffs. So, to paint the full picture, here's what the American fiscal landscape looked like before the sales tax arrived. At the federal level, the government funded itself overwhelmingly through tariffs on imported goods, supplemented by occasional excise taxes on specific products like whiskey or tobacco, and by revenues from public land sales. The total federal budget was tiny by modern standards, rarely exceeding 3% of GDP before the 20th century. Washington's responsibilities were limited and its needs were modest. At the state level, the picture was more complex and more chaotic. States relied on a patchwork of property taxes, poll taxes, license fees, lottery revenues, toll receipts from state-owned infrastructure, and occasional direct taxes on specific goods. There was no uniformity. Each state had its own unique mix of revenue sources, shaped by its geography, its economy, its political culture, and the relative power of its various interest groups. And at the local level, property taxes dominated so completely that towns and counties were for all practical purposes funded by a single tax. This system, messy and uneven as it was, held together for well over a century, and it might have continued indefinitely if not for two seismic events that shattered the old fiscal order within a few decades of each other. The first was the ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913, which gave Congress the power to levy a federal income tax on individuals and corporations. This was a watershed moment in American fiscal history. For the first time, the federal government had a revenue tool that could scale with the economy, collecting more money as incomes rose and as the country grew richer. The income tax quickly eclipsed tariffs as the primary source of federal revenue. By the 1920s, tariffs had become a secondary concern, and the federal government's fiscal dependence on customs duties had been broken for good. But notice what happened here. The federal government found a new powerful revenue source. The states by and large did not. Many states began experimenting with their own income taxes during this period, but the administrative challenges were enormous. Collecting income taxes required detailed information about individual earnings, sophisticated record keeping, and a bureaucracy capable of auditing and enforcing compliance. For many states, especially smaller and more rural ones, this was simply beyond their capacity in the early 20th century. And that brings us to the event that finally forced the creation of the modern state sales tax, the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929 and the American economy began its long, devastating slide, the fiscal impact on state and local governments was catastrophic. Property values plummeted, tax delinquency skyrocketed. By 1933, property tax delinquency nationwide reached a staggering 26.3%, a record that still stands to this day. More than a quarter of all property owners in the country simply stopped paying their taxes because they couldn't afford to. At the same time, whatever income taxes states had been collecting dried up as unemployment soared and wages collapsed. State governments were trapped. The revenue was collapsing at precisely the moment when the demand for government services, relief for the unemployed, support for the destitute, maintenance of basic public order was exploding. Property tax revenues actually increased as a share of GDP between 1929 and 1932 from 4.3% to 7.4%, but only because GDP was falling so much faster than tax collections. In real terms, the money simply wasn't there. Overall taxes nearly doubled as a share of national income from 11.6% in 1929 to 21.1% in 1932, and the human cost was devastating. Farmers lost their land, families lost their homes, and voters predictably were furious. The result was something that historians historians call the Great Depression tax revolts. Across the country, property owners organized strikes, refused to pay their taxes, and demanded relief. In some cities, the revolts were more extreme than anything the modern Tea Party movement ever imagined. Property owners didn't just complain, they formed organizations, passed petitions, and in some cases physically intimidated tax assessors and collectors. Under enormous political pressure, states began slashing property tax rates, adopting homestead exemptions, and reducing property assessments. State property tax revenues as a share of total revenue dropped from 27% in 1929 to 19% in 1932, and then cratered to just 7% by 1937. Local property tax collections fell from $4.3 billion in 1929 to $3.7 billion by 1934. The property tax, the ancient tax, was the first tax in the world. 34. The property tax, the ancient cornerstone of American public finance, was crumbling under the weight of the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. And that's when the sales tax entered the picture. Desperate for revenue and politically unable to raise property taxes any further, state after state turned to a new idea: a broad-based tax on retail transactions. Mississippi led the way, converting its existing gross receipts tax into something resembling a modern retail sales tax. In 1930, with the former legislation codified in 1932, West Virginia, which had imposed a limited sales tax on specific commodities like coal and oil as early as 1921, enacted a freestanding retail sales tax in 1933. And then the floodgates opened. 23 states adopted general sales taxes during the 1930s alone. Kentucky introduced a 3% sales tax in 1934, and 24 more states quickly followed suit. The Depression didn't just create the modern state sales tax, it created an entirely new fiscal architecture for American government, one that included sales taxes, state income taxes, and corporate income taxes, all adopted in rapid succession as states scrambled to replace the revenue they were losing from collapsing property values. But here's the part that often gets left out of the textbooks. The sales tax wasn't just a neutral technocratic solution to a fiscal crisis. It was a political choice, and it had clear winners and losers. The sales tax is what economists call a regressive tax, meaning it takes a larger percentage of income from people who earn less. A billionaire and a minimum wage worker both pay the same percentage on a gallon of milk. But for the worker, that tax represents a much bigger share of their total earnings. The sales tax was adopted precisely because it was politically easier to impose than alternatives like higher income taxes on the wealthy or more progressive property assessments. It spread the burden across the entire population, which meant no single powerful interest group bore the brunt. Wealthy landowners who had been the primary targets of property taxes got relief. Industrialists and financial elites, whose income might have been taxed more aggressively under a different system, were largely spared. The cost was shifted to consumers, to ordinary people making everyday purchases. It was in its own way a profoundly political act disguised as fiscal necessity. And the timing was remarkable. After Prohibition officially ended in December of 1933, 29 states restructured their alcohol taxes as sales excise taxes rather than continuing to rely on licensing fees. The end of Prohibition didn't just bring back legal drinking, it created an entirely new revenue stream that states eagerly tapped. The sales tax wasn't a single innovation, it was part of a wholesale transformation of American public finance that happened in the space of a single decade, driven by the worst economic catastrophe the country had ever experienced. By the time the dust settled, the American tax landscape had been completely remade. The old system in which states relied overwhelmingly on property taxes and the federal government relied on tariffs was gone. In its place was the modern structure we recognize today, a layered system of federal income taxes, state and local sales taxes, and local property taxes, each occupying its own niche in the fiscal ecosystem. Sales taxes today account for roughly 45% of all state tax revenue nationwide, and about a third of state government revenues overall. They are the single largest source of tax revenue from most state governments, second only to income taxes in the states that levy both. Only 5 states, Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon, still don't have a statewide sales tax. And even within some of those states, local jurisdictions have imposed their own. The story of how America got from 1789 to 1930 without a sales tax isn't just a history lesson. It reveals something fundamental about the relationship between governments and the people they govern. Every tax is a political decision. Every revenue system reflects the priorities, the prejudices, and the power dynamics of the society that created it. The founding generation chose tariffs because they were easy to collect and because they served the interests of northern manufacturers who wanted protection from foreign competition. States chose property taxes because land was the most visible and most difficult to hide form of wealth in a predominantly agricultural society. And when the Depression destroyed the property tax base, states chose the sales tax because it was administratively simple, politically feasible, and it didn't threaten the interests of the people who held the most power. What's remarkable when you step back back and look at the full sweep of this history is how recent all of it really is. The federal income tax is barely over a century old. The state sales tax is younger than that. For most of American history, the government was funded by a patchwork of tariffs, property taxes, lotteries, license fees, poll taxes, and bond sales. It was a system held together by improvisation, political compromise, and occasionally brute force. And it worked, more or less. Until it didn't. Until the world changed, the economy transformed, and the old tools were no longer equal to the new demands. The sales tax wasn't inevitable. It was the product of a specific crisis, at a specific moment, adopted by desperate politicians with no better options. And now, nearly a century later, it's so deeply embedded in the fabric of American life that most people can't imagine a world without it. But of course, nothing in the world of taxation is ever truly settled. The debates that Hamilton and Jefferson had about tariffs versus excise taxes, the fights over property tax assessments in the 1830s, the tax revolts of the Great Depression, these are not ancient history. They are the same debates we're having right now, just wearing different clothes. Who pays, how much, and who decides? Those questions are as old as civilization itself, and they'll be with us long after every tax code currently in effect has been rewritten, reformed, or thrown out entirely. The history of American taxation isn't just about numbers and revenue streams. It's about the fundamental bargain between the citizen and the state, and that bargain, as we've seen, is always being renegotiated. If this story opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, consider subscribing to the channel. We go deep on the hidden forces behind money, power, and the systems that shape our world. Drop a comment below telling me which pre-sales tax revenue source surprised you the most. And if you haven't already, hit that like button because the algorithm rewards it. And honestly, so do I. I'll see you in the next one.